middle of the week update on some stuff that I'm looking at in Genesis that we can't fit into the message. This week, I wanted to read a passage from Genesis 25 that is kind of controversial and it needs some extra explanation. And just get your guys' feedback. I think it's stuff that's interesting. It's stuff that I'm interested by, but doesn't fit neatly into like a 3-point sermon on Sunday. So Genesis chapter 25, the first couple of verses 1 through 6 say this. Abraham took another wife. This is after the story of Isaac and Rebekah, whose name was Keturah. She bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Joksan fathered Sheba and Dedan. The sons of Dedan were Ashurim, Leshuim, and Leuim. I'm messing all of these up, and it continues to go on with this genealogy. Abraham gave all he had to Isaac, but the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts. So we have verse 1 is suggesting that he married another wife after Sarah's death, but now verse 6 suggests that this was a concubine. And while he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country. Regardless of whether it was a wife or it was a concubine, we have an additional potential heir to what Isaac is entitled to, and clearly Abraham is making he's making it clear that the primary person to inherit the blessing is going to be Isaac. But that word concubine is uncomfortable, especially, it's uncomfortable for me. What in the world, if Abraham is practicing a relationship with a woman as a concubine, isn't that against God's best? Isn't that against Christian teaching? So let's keep reading. Jump down to verse 12. These then are the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar, the Egyptian, Sarah's servant, bore to Abraham. And then it goes through a long lineage of Ishmael's offspring. And at the end of the passage, it shows the entire life of Ishmael. These are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years. He breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people. They settled from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite Egypt in the direction of Assyria. He settled over and against all his kinsmen. Why is that passage there? And many people will point out that passage primarily is there to point out, to show that God was faithful in accomplishing what he had promised to Hagar. There's a number of passages where God deals kindly with Hagar, and God honors the son that she bore to Abraham and Sarah, the surrogacy the surrogate role that she played, and that God is faithful to him. But the question that's messy, and the question I want to deal with today, is what do we do with polygamy? Multiple marriages or multiple women in the lives of the patriarchs. What do we do with polygamy, even in just scripture? Because here we have Abraham, the first patriarch and the founder of the Jewish faith, followed up by Isaac and then Jacob, and you just think through that story and the messiness between Rachel and Leah and the handmaidens, Bilhah and such. And it's messy. And what do we do with those passages? And I found this commentary really interesting. I thought that he did a good job summarizing this. So I'm just going to share it and probably commentate on the commentary for just my own thoughts. So polygamy was practiced by godly men in the Old Testament. Full stop. That's uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable. But I think it's a fair statement. Abraham is a godly man. Abraham, it says, we see it all throughout Scripture. Abraham believed in God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. His righteousness was not because of his multiple wives. It's because of his belief. It's because of his faithful view of the person of God. So he is not, the Scripture is not commending his behavior towards his relationships with women. Indeed, the narrator presents David, good old David and Bathsheba David, under blessing by contrasting his many sons and several wives with the impotence of the house of Saul. See 2 Samuel chapter 3. He also presents David under divine wrath by having his wives taken from him in 2 Samuel 12. The practice, however, the practice of multiple wives often led to strife among the wives and the siblings of several wives. He gives references, though the same can be said of the siblings by the same marriage. In Genesis 4, Adam and Eve have two sons, that's Cain and Abel, and that strife doesn't just come from multiple marriages. You have dysfunctional families in all kinds of settings. The law, however, did not forbid polygamy. Now, this is where it gets a little uncomfortable. In fact, it regulated it. Quote, if a man marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, or marital rights. Exodus 21:10. The law forbade a man from having a harem. We see this in Deuteronomy 17 and 1 Kings 11. Or from indulging his sensual pleasure without regard to the rights of his wife. Obviously, however, polygamy was not a violation of the command, you shall not commit adultery, from Exodus 20 of the 10 Commandments. If it's allowed or if it's regulated later on in Exodus, how can we have multiple marriages that don't violate the idea of adultery? It makes us uncomfortable in a culture where that is so foreign, such a foreign concept. Nevertheless, and I like how he brings this back, polygamy was not the original intention. God gave Abraham one wife, not several. And the practice was introduced by the depraved Lamech in Genesis 4:19. Christ aimed to restore the original idea in his church, for the law had only accommodated itself to the hardness of the human heart. This is in Matthew 19. If you look at it from verses 1 through 19, Jesus goes and says, look, I permitted divorce because of the hardness of your heart. I was allowing things under the law that were not my best. And in the same way that I permitted divorce, this author is arguing that the same argument that that Matthew 19 makes to limit divorce is the same argument that we as New Testament Christians ought to behave under in terms of God's original intention of one man and one wife, one man and one woman in a marriage relationship for a lifetime. Therefore, back to the commentary, an elder, a leader, or deacon in the church is to only be the husband of one wife. 1 Timothy 3 lays that out. So here is just a summary thought from me. There are some interesting arguments right now to justify behaviors outside a covenantal lifetime relationship between one man and one woman. And the Bible is getting kind of warped and shifted and like we're trying to make it say it's something that it doesn't say. If you wanted to make an argument about sexuality and what the Bible allows for, probably the argument that would be the easiest to make would be the fact that polygamy is allowed, but it's not God's best. It's not God's best. It is people who live under the full idea of the law through Jesus. He says he didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. In Matthew, in the Sermon on the Mount, we as people who want to live with that idea of fulfilling the law should actually look at these passages about polygamy and go, that's not God's best and that's not okay. It's not okay in my life, and it wasn't okay even in Abraham's life or Jacob's life. God worked with it. God works with them in their brokenness. He worked with David in his brokenness. He continues to work with us in our brokenness. But we don't have to be comfortable with or justify polygamy anymore. Anyway, some thoughts. We'd love to hear your feedback. We'll talk to you on Sunday.